There we go. Okay, and now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Birte Pfleger is a professor of early American history at California State University, Los Angeles. She's the author of Ethnicity Matters, A History of the German Society of Pennsylvania, which, as I mentioned, was published by the GHI in 2006. She's also the author of German Immigration to Philadelphia from the Colonial Period through the 20th Century in Global Philadelphia, Immigrant Communities, Old and New, published by Temple University Press in 2010, and A Horrible State of Affairs, Race, Slavery, and General Emancipation in Pennsylvania in Babel of the Atlantic, Language and Cultural Politics in Colonial Pennsylvania, published by Penn State Press in 2019. She's written more than a dozen book reviews and presented her work at conferences across the US, Germany, Great Britain, and Australia. She's currently researching Kurt Molzahn, a German-born Lutheran clergyman in Philadelphia, in Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the pastor who was a Nazi spy. In collaboration with Kevin Ostoyich, she is also working on Auf Wiedersehen, Two German Teenagers, and the Second World War. And now I'm going to turn it over to Birte.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, Bettina, for inviting me to think about the German Society's Women's Auxiliary, and to see so many of you that that I've met what seems like a really long time ago. You know, I got married in Philadelphia that year that I spent at the German Society. Had my rehearsal dinner in the basement, I think. You know, I have two kids, one of whom is home today from school because he's sick again. But somehow we all survived the pandemic, and so onward we go. So thank you so much for taking the time to come. I'm not going to have a lot of answers. I have lots of questions. So what I'm going to talk about, I also wanted to do something that's not basically a repetition of the chapter I wrote on the Women's Auxiliary, that really talks about their work in the 1930s, because that is the best documented work that I have found where you can tell stories. So I want to, this is the photo that most of you have seen, right? This famous photo that seems photoshopped in some areas. And I would still like to know, like, why was this taken? This is 1927. Many of the women who are in here were also among the founding members. As you probably remember, the German Society in 1849 wrote this one line in their minutes the day after Christmas for the annual meeting, saying that they weren't going to allow women to become members. That was that. So it takes then until 1901 for the women to found their auxiliary. And sort of the questions are, so this is the charter. This is their reason, right? The charter and object of the corporation is to relieve deserving and needy persons and families, and to assist the German Society of Pennsylvania in its work of charity, and for that purpose to raise funds from admission fees and dues from members by gifts, bequests, and entertainments. Here are the 21 founding directors, and Antonia Ehrlich is, of course, the first one. Mary Paulus, who is the treasurer. And we have Minna Delcy is right here. We have, I think that's it for the founding members who are then alive in that photo from 1927. So here we are again. So the question is, why do they create a separate organization? And the short answer is, because they had been denied membership to the male part of the society. And it's part of the progressive movement, right? There are so many organizations that have women's auxiliaries, or where women just found an organization organization. I mean, the Lutheran churches have them, the Catholic churches have them, the Cannstatter Verein has them. All of these organizations have women involved in charity work. So the Germans, the Frauenhilfsverein actually joins kind of late in all of this. And they're very dedicated. And so they want to make sure that they get to be part of this progressive movement. Their relationship to the German society is never easy. They continue to squabble about little things. You know, can they sell tickets for events, or can they charge for, or the German society, the men really wanted the women to charge for the food and beverages rather than an admission ticket. And that may have been a legal question, although I haven't quite figured out what the legal question was. But so anyway, they squabble about everything. They squabble about how the women are treated when they enter the German society. Henry Hoffman, the longtime manager of the whole outfit, I don't think liked the women very much. And so there's always tension, so it seems. However, the women are central in leading the German society as a charitable organization. And that happens very early on. They sort of take over. They spend more money on charity than the German society does. And as I've mentioned before, right after World War II, when the German society is under investigation for un-American activities, the women save the German society's tax-exempt status because they show that, you know, they're spending a lot more money on charitable expenses, and in exchange they get one seat on the board. And so that's that part that we've covered before. So I want to talk about some of these women. I mean, I kept staring at this photo and I wanted to know who they are. So I found out a little bit about them. I find it still interesting that when you look at the names, I don't know if you can see that way down here in white. So many of them are known sort of in that German way of it's Frau for being a married woman and then her first and last name. But there are others like Frau Hermann Heil, or Frau Louis Schmidt, or Frau Otto Schweitzer. They have adopted the Anglo way of designating a married woman, right? Using the husband's first name and last name. And yeah, I'm just really interested in why that is, because that is not a German tradition. And maybe Frank Trommler knows more about this, sort of, whether it means anything or not. I just find it interesting. I think my mother-in-law, long before she passed, I think she at some point addressed a letter to my husband and me as Mr. and Mrs. Robert Cullen, and I don't know. I never liked that. That being disappearing as an individual very much, because that's what I think it means, that these women disappear as individuals. But they shouldn't, because they have these amazing stories that I think deserve to be told. The sources that we have, and thank you, Bettina, for making so many available to me. The sources that I've used to find out a little bit more about these women is through Ancestry.com, which is, if you're not a member there, it's amazing for genealogical research, even for Germany. Not just even. My sister has now found ancestors of mine from the 1780s, which, is really fun. I want to talk about their work. The post-war eras is when they really go into high gear. Of course, the Great Depression, and of course, this annual Christmas event that they hosted. I also think that there's a real science of charity that's part of the progressive era, and then there's always the question of who was worthy. So let me see. So how does it all start? Really, in the post-Civil War era is when the United States in urban centers begins to experience homelessness. It really isn't an issue before, simply because people just sleep wherever, but they're not sleeping in the streets. But now, especially men, sort of roam the country and go from one city to another, the tramps, the hobos. And someone like John Wanamaker and other prominent leaders in Philadelphia began this Sunday Breakfast Association, which quickly turned into a place where people could get 3 meals a day, 365 days a year. So this is part of, and of course, Wanamaker is of German origin, and this is part of this charitable desire and movement to start helping poor people who are now really everywhere. So then we get to Antonie Ehrlich, the founding president of the Women's Auxiliary. So she's really fascinating. So first of all, she gives birth to 9 children, but only 5 of them are living. And this is from the 1910 census. She is listed as a company owner of knit goods, and she wrote at least 6 crochet booklets. Here is one of the covers. You can still buy these. At the time, they cost 10 cents. The earlier versions, I think, were about 4 or 5 cents. To give you an idea, 5 cents is quite a bit of money. Well, in 1910 terms, it's sort of more difficult, but early on, the German Society or the Women's Auxiliary would give around $4 a month to a family in support. So are you spending 10 cents of that money for a booklet on how to crochet? Probably not. And her husband owns this publishing company. Their home on Venango Street is mortgaged. And this is all, again, from the 1910 census. In 1900, they rent a home. So that's their first home. By 1910, they are homeowners, and it's mortgaged. Her husband now, however, dies very soon. So let's see when. And I wanted to see sort of how long it would take. So initially in 1900, Antonie Ehrlich would have been able to walk from her home to the German Society. That wasn't even a mile, so I can see her walking possibly. So now her husband, he dies in 1904. He was a Civil War soldier. I'm trying to see how I can make this work here. He dies suddenly. He's only 68 years old. So most of the time that Antonie Ehrlich was the president of the Women's Auxiliary, she's a widow, and she still has these kids, right? I mean, they are adults at this point, but they still live at home. She has a cousin living with her and a niece. In 1900, they also have Paul Ehrlich, the brother-in-law, living with them. I'm sorry, this is 1910 already. I apologize, should have done that differently. When they moved to Venango Street, so first of all, she now has a mortgage. I don't know how she pays this off. Does he have a life insurance? But they don't move for a while. Her husband dies, and she still has to pay this house off. And she is now a little over 4 miles away from the German Society. And I know she goes regularly because they meet every Monday afternoon to talk about charity cases. So there's a bus service available. It's motorized by 1923. There is, Philadelphia is one of those places that had buses pretty early on. There is the horse-drawn buses already in the mid-19th century, but they cost around somewhere between 3 and 4 cents. So she probably has money to do that, but the charity cases, I remember from some of the records that they oftentimes would give the poor people who came to the Christmas celebration, that they would also give them then bus fare or streetcar fare to be able to attend this. So, but these are all things that we need to consider when we think about Antonie Ehrlich's work for the German society. So she's not walking 4 miles, certainly not at this age. And she dies young. So she dies in 1928. So a year after that famous photo is taken, she dies. She dies of heart disease. And then look at the obituary. Again, she is known as, the first thing is, yeah, she is Mrs. Antonia Ehrlich, but she's the widow of Franz Ehrlich. She's born in Germany, and this is who her father was. He used to have a hotel. And then it's all about her husband who was a captain during the Civil War. And then the last sentence is about her 27 years as president of the Ladies' Aid Society, of the German Society. So that's Antonia Ehrlich, really remarkable woman who, was a widow for 24 years, manages to own the house free and clear. One of her daughters never marries and ends up living in the house later on. So then we have Henrietta Keller. Henrietta Keller is quite a bit younger. She's the only one of the lot who lives for a very long time, right? Who lives until she's 92. They also own a home. Her husband was Harry, a high school professor. And later he dies and he's a principal. So let's look at this family. This is, again, the 1910 census. So she joins, she's not the original, one of the founding members, but she's in that 1927 photo. So she's got 4 kids, and then she has 2 servants. And we know a little bit about the servants. We know that Bertha was a cook for the family, and she had immigrated just a year earlier from Switzerland. And Julia was listed as a chambermaid, and her parents were both from Hungary, but she was born in Philadelphia. So these are the 2 servants. This is a big household. Harry Keller dies suddenly of a stroke. So again, we have this woman who was a widow then for a very long time, and who has to manage somehow, and manage in a way that is quite interesting. So for a while, in 1930, she lives with her young son-in-law, who's 29 years old. He's a young doctor. They're 2.7 miles away from the German Society, but we know she goes all the time, right? I mean, she's in the record there. But by 1940, she lives in a house that she owns, like she's listed as the head of the household, and now the son-in-law and daughter and the grandkids are living with her. The house is worth $10,000. It's 3.1 miles away from the German Society. She eventually dies of sepsis, and she has gangrene in her left foot. But she dies at a very nice old age. But I find it interesting. So I don't know why she's living with her son. He is listed as the head of the household, but then later on, she is the head of the household, and they live with her. What I've also noticed in census records is that they get a lot of stuff wrong. At some point, Antonia Ehrlich is listed as male, and the dates of birth keep changing a little bit. Oftentimes, women seem to become younger, which I understand. But so they, the census keepers don't always get it right. Then we have Emma Heil. She was a secretary, and she kept really excellent record of everything. Again, early on, when she lives on North Street, she has a 6-minute walk to the German Society, easy peasy. She can do this. She has, I'm trying to count, she has 4 children, and in the next census, 2 of these children have died. That you think back to Antonia Ehrlich, who also shared that same fate, right? Who had children die, and Emma Heil. What conversations did they have outside of the charity business, right? These are 2 mothers who lost children. How did they lose them? What happened? Eventually, Emma Heil moves in with her son after, this is actually not when her son, her husband hasn't died yet. So in 1930, it's not quite clear what has happened here because Emma is not listed. That's what I mean about the census takers not always getting things right. Is Emma out at the German Society on that day and they just forgot to mention her because she's not dead and I don't think they've divorced or are living separate lives. Eventually we know that they have moved in with her son, with her oldest son. And again, she is the widow of Hermann Heil. That's how she is noted. But she was also a member of Zion Lutheran Church and a life member of the Ladies Auxiliary. So she is, again, known for this and celebrated for that. She herself was an immigrant. She had come with her father, and this is their gravestone. So it's amazing what you can still find, right, about these women. And there's Minnie Delcy. Minnie Delcy was the daughter of German immigrants. She was an only child and she never married. And she just, has this kind of stern look about her. She is a founding member of the German Society of Women's Auxiliary. And I have not tracked down yet at what point she begins earning her $40 a month. Very early on, she sort of runs errands for them. Because when you think about once they approve $3 for a family, how did the $3 actually get to that family? Well, they can stop by the office in a very narrow time window when Henry Hoffman is available, or they have people pick these things up. And this is sort of the apprenticeship for female social workers. They get to go from one charitable organization to another and pick up and drop off notes and money. So this is Minnie. She lives in our parents' home, of course, at a very young age, and that's really close, right? That's a half a mile walk. But by 1930, first of all, she is listed as a retired social worker, even though she's still every day at the German Society. And she has a 50-year-old female boarder, but she owns that home on North Street. So that's quite remarkable. She was making $40 a month, and $40 a month is basically if a family showed that they had $40 a month, they no longer qualified for relief. But it also depends on when are you talking about, right? By the way, she dies of chronic heart disease and Parkinson's. Okay, so now Minnie Delcy has died, the paid social worker who has done everything. She dies, and Bertha Schweitzer becomes now president of the organization and really the heart of the organization until her death. She's married, of course, famously to the sculptor Otto Schweitzer, and she dies before him. So, but she also note here the date. She dies just before Pearl Harbor, so she doesn't know that this is about to happen. When you look at the correspondence, and again, the records are so sort of spotty, most of the correspondence is being sent to her home. So this is, of course, coming from the German Society, from the Women's Auxiliary here, again, the 2 cents. So they spend somewhere between $3 and $6 a month on postage. But I'm wondering about the countless letters that Mrs. Schweitzer did not bring back to the German Society office, right, to be recorded. And there are a few things, for example, here, this is being sent to her home. This is at Venango Street. By the way, yes, Schweitzer and Ehrlich were neighbors. They lived right next to each other, or I think 2 houses away from each other. And this is from the chocolate company, the Whitman company, that yes, they are going to give them again chocolate for their Christmas party, but these are going to be the imperfect ones, right? For poor people, for charitable purposes, you're going to give your sentence. You're going to give the imperfect ones, and they're going to be dropped off, just like they have done every year. This is 1934, and this is really important because people really are suffering. This is part of this science of charity. There are more than 200 charitable organizations that are listed here, and they have these abbreviations. So why do you need to know this if you're trying to decide on a case? Well, they were part of the social service exchange, and that meant all charitable cases were tracked somehow, so that if you had maybe 3 or 4 organizations, each giving somewhere around $4 or $5 a month, then that would be enough. You wanted to make sure that you could spread the wealth, that anyone who was Catholic, for example, would get something from a Catholic organization. And you had to be either German or of German descent if you wanted to get money from the Women's Auxiliary. So they want to categorize people, according to ethnicity, according to religion, according to a variety of other things. And then you want to make sure that no one gets too much, and that the right organization helps the right charitable case. And then the fun ones, the who are the people. So not only does every application for charitable donations get sort of the, okay, here are the organizations that are going to be responsible for this, but also who are these people? All right, let's list them all. Man and mother somehow have the same abbreviation. And then, of course, the par amour, the ex. I haven't looked too closely yet to find out how many X's there are, but these things are, again, very important to know. So you can just imagine how Minnie Delsey was really busy trying to make sure she understood all of this. I'm sure she had memorized it at that point. If you want to learn more about this and have the time, the HSP has the Family Service of Philadelphia records, and 90 boxes. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on here. The Family Society of Philadelphia is the first charitable organization that basically offers a homeless shelter, but they require the poor men to work. They have to chop wood, and eventually that actually becomes a business. For the Family Society of Philadelphia, they sell firewood, and being produced by the people who work there, who are their charitable cases. No one was supposed to stay too long. I think it was somewhere around 3 or 4 months. There were some women there, and they were doing sewing work. So remember the sewing basement in the German society as part of the Women's Auxiliary? Well, remember, they put poor women there to work, to produce things. So again, this is part of the progressive movement, that poor people are going to somehow work their way out of poverty and to contribute to their well-being. All right, here is the last woman that I know anything about, Mary Paulus. She identifies herself as Mrs. Joseph Paulus. She is the treasurer, and she keeps very careful track. Very nice handwriting. She does this in German. And again, this is in the 1930s. And this is like one of their budgets here, where she writes down what's going on. She's at every weekly meeting. And here's the famous Mr. Hoffman. Many of you have seen that photo before. He worked at the GSP from 1923 until 1940. Because he has this very generic name, I can't find him in the census data yet. He has very nice handwriting, and Frank probably can verify this, but it seems to me very German handwriting to me. And of course, he also writes in German, right? And he says the first Wednesday of the month is the Frauenhilfsverein. I think this is something about Gesellschaft, 3 Uhr nachmittags. Something's happening at 3 o'clock in the afternoon there. And his office hours are very short, Monday through Friday, 9 to 10 a.m. or 3 to 5 p.m. And you can just sort of imagine people walking in there, having a seat, having to wait, and then walking around and sitting in front of his desk and pleading their case. And just want to briefly talk about post-World War I aid. And this is where this picture is really from. Yes, it's from Christmas, but I think in the background there, they're also working on sending stuff to Germany. This is there's only one letter from Germany, and this girl, her mother sends this as a thank you, because apparently for over a decade, the German Society or the Women's Auxiliary has been helping her. How they find her in particular, I don't know. How much they sent, I don't know. But this girl, this is a picture of her. She had just returned from being able to go sort of to a wellness, a vacation for 4 weeks, and the mother had missed her so much, but wanted to thank the ladies for being able, for supporting this effort. And here's the question of, when do people get enough charity? This is again from 1930, and here the letter says, this is from the Family Society of Philadelphia that I mentioned before. Here are all the organizations that are helping this this family, and they're saying that let's see, so I have also been speaking to the superintendent of the district in which Mrs. Mack lives, and she tells me that since Mrs. Mack was receiving the money from her sons and the allowance from the German Society, beside the allowance from the various other agencies, the Cannstatter and Hessen-Darmstädter and our organizations, feels that she has enough income now to manage. So that's how they decide when someone actually has enough. And then comes poor Mrs. Elizabeth Brown. I'm not sure why the Women's Auxiliary received this letter. Again, the letter is addressed to Mrs. Schweitzer's home address. And somehow people are having a really hard time spelling her last name. I mean, she is Schweizer, she is Schweizer with a TZ, which there are various variations of how her name is spelled. Nevertheless, the story of Mrs. Brown is just really funny. Well, funny and sad in so many ways. So this is sort of a warning letter from the Travelers Aid Society saying, if this Mrs. Brown shows up, don't give her anything. And here's the background story. So Mrs. Brown was a widow from Hungary. Her husband was a Ralph von Braun. So somewhere, some aristocracy in there, who knows how, they must have been somehow German in some ways. So she and her husband lived in Philadelphia before World War I, sometime around the turn of the century. But then they leave right before the war begins. Her husband dies. Her only daughter dies, and she wants to come back to the United States. And the Hungarian police department somehow supports this. They give her money for her to be able to go. So she arrives in New York, and I was able to find the list of United States citizens on this arrival list. So you can see when people travel back and forth, and Mrs. Brown is somewhere around here. The name of the ship is listed and who she's going to go to. So she claims that she has a friend, Mr. Brodersen in Philadelphia, who will vouch for her and who will support her. So the Travelers Aid Society contacts Mr. Brodersen, and who says, yeah, I have no money. My father has long died, and my mother is living with my sister and has no money. We can't take her in. I'm giving you $20. Tell her not to use that money to come to Philadelphia. Okay, so now she's got $20. And what does she do? She gets herself into a taxi, runs up a $4 taxi bill, to try to find a hotel where she has heard that German immigrants or immigrants can stay for cheap. She doesn't find that cheap hotel and instead goes into the Stratford Hotel, where a room costs an astonishing $3 a night. And she puts herself up there until she runs out of money. So now the $20 are gone. And she goes back to the Travelers Aid Society and says, I need to get to Philadelphia. And what can she actually do for a living? Well, she says that she has been teaching sewing and embroidery in Budapest. And, she'd be happy to do that anywhere where they can put her. I don't know what happens to her. Just this warning letter is sent out that says, don't help her. She has refused to cooperate with anything. She is an American citizen and therefore doesn't qualify for German society help anyway. And she closes this by saying that the above information is confidential and should under no circumstances be delivered to Mrs. Brown. I don't know what happened to poor Mrs. Brown. With a name like that, it's kind of difficult to find out more. And if you're wondering about citizenship, married women assumed the husband's citizenship upon naturalization of the husband between 1790 and 1906. There were a few variations after that, but for the most part, it wasn't until the 1950s that women no longer lost their citizenship status if they married a foreigner. Okay, big help comes in 1934. This is right before the Social Security Act. It's about a year earlier when Pennsylvania actually begins to give out pensions to people over the age of 70. They have to be citizens and they have to have lived in Pennsylvania for at least 15 years. But that money, and it's $30 a month, that really helps all charitable organizations and of course poor people. Because it's usually the old people who have such a hard time with all this. Online, there are all kinds of things available about what women's wages actually were. So if you think back to the Ehrlich family with their two, or the Keller family with their two servants, what is this chambermaid actually making? What I find interesting is that living in servants were actually making more than those who were not living in. Which seems sort of counterintuitive to me, but maybe I'm not seeing something here. But few people who don't live with the family work every day, of course. So on average, people were making $3 a day. This is women making $3 a day, but you don't work every day. And, that's something to consider when you're thinking about what people are making. Cost of clothing, because so much that the women's auxiliary does revolves around clothing, right? They keep collecting clothing, they mend clothing constantly to be able to give it to others. Then there are letters about a coat being dropped off and how wonderful that coat is, but she wasn't, her donation wasn't appreciated sufficiently. So what about clothing? Well, clothing is really expensive when inflation is really high and right after World War I. But then actually inflation goes down and the cost of clothing goes down, somewhat at least. But nevertheless, clothing is valuable and important. These are lists of the sort of that price index that we constantly watch and how we know that we still are at 5% almost inflation right now. Well, these are the prices for cereals, bakery goods, and beef. And just let's just say people are not eating a lot of steak. People are eating breads. People are eating, cornmeal. And there was another page that sort of showed for charity organizations sort of the minimum requirements for a diet and whether it was going to be sort of an emergency diet or a more luxurious diet. Lots of bread, lots of wheat, not a lot of meat, not a lot of vegetables or fruit. These are now the photos of the World War II relief sorting. And I thought this was just such a fascinating one here. So here's the boys' clothing being already nicely folded. Here are a bunch of dolls And then here's a bunch of laundry soap. So these are just containers and huge boxes full of donations that need to be sorted. And these are the photos that Bettina was also referring to. So they're labeled here, Women of German Organization Working for Relief for Germany. This is 1946 in the Quaker Relief Warehouse. That warehouse a while ago was being considered for apartment buildings. I don't know if that happened or not. And I'm assuming these are German Society women or Women's Auxiliary women. This is obviously at this Quaker Relief Warehouse because this would not be taking place at the German Society. They don't have the equipment. They don't have, the space quite there. But it's definitely seems to be a community effort. I'm wondering if anyone recognizes, especially this young woman here. She's the only one that's really young. I don't know who any of these women are. They're not labeled, unfortunately. And the women from the 1927 photo are probably mostly dead. Maybe this is Henrietta Keller. I don't know. She's still alive, and this is probably 1946, although again, this photo is not labeled. And I can send Bettina this PowerPoint slides so that you guys can maybe, if you want to look more at this. This is one of the photos that I actually found at the German Society, 17 years ago, and that one was labeled as May of 1946. Again, people are mending clothing that they had that had been donated, and they're sending most of this, packaging this up to be put into these bales and being shipped to Germany. This is, I think, the 1950s. I'm not sure. I'm sort of trying to see how this is different, but this is definitely at the German Society. Some sociability, right? They're having a good time celebrating. Where can you find out more about this World War II effort? You can go to again, this is a real link, the American Friends Service Committee History and Archive, and the Holocaust Encyclopedia actually has some sources, because the American Friends Service Committee was only one of 15 organizations that were allowed to work in post-World War II Germany. They had not been accepted to the Russian zone quite yet. But this is where, when they're packaging all of this, this is where, I had a different photo somewhere, sorry. This is where it's being sent and how it's being sent. Once again, thank you notes are incredibly important. They published this bulletin on the relief effort. And so this comes back as sort of like, this is how it was received. So thank you letters are important. Those are also very prominent among the records of the Women's Auxiliary, people sending thank you notes. And then who's deserving? And I think this is worthwhile to point out, that they, in this bulletin, seem to make a point to say that the need of the refugees is carefully investigated by the Refugee Commissioner and the mayors and those in direct charge of the refugees, so that actual relief of those suffering can be guaranteed. In order to avoid giving clothing twice to some refugees, intentionally or unintentionally, a note of all gifts is made in the files of the Wirtschaftsamt and in the passbook of each refugee. So God forbid someone gets 2 coats, right? And in accordance with the tradition of our organization, and also in accordance with our wishes, we chose the children regardless of the present or past political convictions of their parents. No one is asked, were you a Nazi or not? We believe that in this, we will carry out the wishes of the donors and of your committee. We look up on these donations as a donation, not of any organization, but of many individual Americans imbued with a desire to help the needy children of Germany, children who cannot be blamed for what has happened these last 12 years. So they're not going to worry about it. These are Quakers, right? This is what they do. They also refer back to what they had done during and after World War I. and how many children had benefited. And in all of this, it's always about the children. They're sending also a lot of dried milk powder, and they're sending a lot of cocoa powder. And the children then write back of, how they never had cocoa before and how wonderful it is, and all that. So I'm sorry this took longer. I have lots of questions, and I just want to say that it is because of your efforts to transcribe a lot of these records, and Bettina putting them onto this digital archive, that these things are available to historians, and it's just awesome that you're continuing with all of this work.
All right. Thank you, Birte. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's see. I think we have time for questions if anyone has them, or comments or discussion. I didn't see anything in the chat, but Maria, I see a raised hand somewhere.
Okay. Can I say something?
Yes, go ahead, Frank.
Birte, it was a wonderful experience to listen to you. You have brought up so many more sources. It is not a chapter in the book, which is already very good, and this was very lively, and in many ways really introduced us into the life of women in Philadelphia who were German, who followed German Sittlichkeitscode and married code and so on. I just wanted to have one remark. You mentioned this Miss, let's say, Frank Miller, this taking over of a male name. When I came for the first time to the United States in the late 60s, and was sitting in discussions and or in family surroundings, and I saw the letter Miss Frank Miller, that was really off-putting. That was something that I would say in the following 10 years into the 70s, it got out of fashion. And in the 80s, there was still some, and you could see the age of the writer, more or less. Younger people didn't use that anymore, and it was a sort of generational thing. Sometimes women were very proud of receiving the letters like this. So it is a generational thing in the I would say out of in the 1980s. But back to your archival research, I compliment you, and I have learned a lot. And I think the whole affair, Doris Simon, would know much more. We have corresponded about it, talked about it, Doris, that the history of the auxiliary, the Women's Auxiliary, was not lost. The Women's Auxiliary has made an enormous contribution to the library, $280,000, and in all these collected dollars. And Doris could probably comment a little bit of how it is to be a member of how it has been a member of the Women's Auxiliary, and looking back at what you, Birte, what you brought out. Maybe Doris could say a word. I just try to bring you in.
Oh, Doris, you have to unmute yourself. You're muted.
Yes. No.
There we go. Okay. Well, the only thing I would add, Birte, first of all, thank you very much. And I remember being down there in the Ratskeller for your rehearsal dinner. And you say that was 17 years ago?
Yep.
One thing I would add is the Women's Auxiliary is, I know it from my active time, from the 80s on, I guess. We expanded a lot of help for the German side as far as scholarship went, and also help directly to the German Society. And we were very fortunate to have some bequests from people that gave us the opportunity to invest that money and use the earnings, you know, to help out in an expanded way as far as not just helping poor people.
Yes, absolutely. So after World War II, you know, the mission of all of these organizations really changes. Absolutely. Yeah. So I have a lot of work to do there.
If I may, Birte, thank you very much. I think it's really fascinating the way you place the Women's Auxiliary in the context of progressive charitable organizations. I don't think that connection has, at least it's the extent of that connection is new to me in terms of the history of progressive era charitable movements. And I think it's a very important foundation because, of course, state welfare didn't take hold in the United States to anything like the degree we know it today until after World War II. So I think and you know how well and thoroughly organized that help was among these progressive women's organizations, I think is a very important contribution just in terms of understanding American social history. You, at the very outset, you made a remark about an article treating about something that you wrote relating to the Women's Auxiliary in the 1930s. Is that in your book that appears?
Yes, yes. I mean that chapter on the Women's Auxiliary, I think the heart of that chapter is the cases, the charitable cases of the 1930s that I was able to where I was able to tell a complete story of this is what they needed, this is what they got, and here are the thank you letters, and this is how it ended to, you know, this one family by 1938, they own a home, the husband has work again, and they no longer need to be invited to the Christmas event. Right. So that's the stories that I was able to tell in that chapter, and that's really the focus of that.
Thank you.
I think, Horace McPherson, you're muted. Were you trying to say something as well?
You're still muted.
Oh, Birte, one let's say important item that came up also with fellowships in recent years, the connection with the Quakers. Since it was so important during and after World War I. Yeah. And to some extent, some of the members apparently were also Quakers. It came up again after the Second World War, and in maybe 2001 or 2, the German Consul General in New York opened an exhibition of the Quakers in Philadelphia, of the Philadelphia Quakers, helping Germans, and with all the thank you notes and so on. I just want to know whether you found more, or whether there is the Quaker archive, let's say, available to look more into these general situation.
Yes, and that's the I'll send you I'll put the link into chat. It's an amazing archive. It's called the American Friends Service Committee Archive, and I'm going to copy the link, and if I can put that, I don't have access to chat. Bettina,
I can't find chat either.
That's weird. I don't know why the chat is not on everybody's
configured.
screen.
Yeah, it's not configured.
There is a whiteboard.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the whiteboard works.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know what
anyway,
happened.
But yes, so there is an online archive, and then of course the HSP has a lot of stuff from them.
Yes, it's Doris McPherson. So somehow you can't unmute yourself? Huh.
There's that little microphone in the far left corner on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or if you click maybe on the top and you.
I see it.
Okay.
Okay,
Good.
am I
Got it.
here?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to say thank you to Birte too, because I had gone through those archives. I was the, Gretchen and I were the people of last resorts with those. And then we did the index. And I remember particularly the records from the 1930s and all of the correspondence that Mrs. Otto Schweitzer had to do between all these agencies. She was getting information from all kinds of people and also required to send, I guess non-Germans were coming to the society, so she would make a referral to another one, and every one of those required typing a letter and telling them all about it. When I think about it, I think, wow, she wasn't even paid.
Right. Enormous amount of work.
Yeah, I was very, very impressed, and she did that for a long time.
Yep.
Yeah, I did not realize it never came out in anything that I saw. This Minadelsi, I had never heard that name before. It wasn't in the archives that we processed, and I never realized that she was paid.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I didn't know
I
about
haven't found his
it. So
record.
the whole idea that they had an employee. Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew that they paid someone 50 cents a week to clean a room or other, but that was all. Yeah. Fascinating, all the details that you've uncovered.
Thank you. And thank you for keeping those records.
Yeah, it wasn't me. We had a big file cabinet and they just got kind of put in there, helter-skelter. But yeah, it was a whole bunch of ladies around a big table, and they got together once a week for I don't know how many months to sift through that stuff and kind of get it into some original order. Yeah. So yeah, it was, in fact, Crystal Tillman led that effort. I don't know whether she's here today. I don't see her, but yeah. It's her idea.
I find it as an outsider. I mean, I remember coming back to this and trying to save it, but for me, it was really first pretty chaotic. And you have done put order into this so that it is an amazing work and in an amazing organization. And I'm very glad that you and your colleagues and Crystal certainly have been so active, and Doris in preserving this. And now it is really the last moment to keep it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's definitely a dissertation there.
Yes.
All right.
Just one more little obscure fact. Mrs. Keller, when my mother came to the United States in 1927, it was the vice president of the Women's Auxiliary that got her her first job with a family out in Ballackinwood, and she was in Stellung. She lived in, and she had an association with those people for the rest of her life. Well, for the rest of their lives. Yeah. Just a little connection.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, based on the census records, most of them had servants living with them, at least one, and then many of them had relatives, be that a cousin or an aunt living with them. So maybe this is more Southern California, as Maria said yesterday in a conversation, but in Los Angeles, we have an incredible homeless crisis. And we're talking 50,000 people who are homeless. It's really staggering. And, I teach in East Los Angeles at a very much urban campus. We have 28,000 students. And I just finished teaching another freshman class with 40 students, and 2 of them were homeless. homeless in a sort of crisis. This is sort of post-pandemic. Their rent had increased because there was, a rent hike, a rent freeze for the longest time, but then and an eviction moratorium that had ended. The rent increased by hundreds of dollars that they couldn't afford. So they had to give up the apartment. The mother moved in with a girlfriend, and here is now the daughter, the student of mine, who was couch surfing. And where was she getting internet? Well, because this was an online course, but we met once a week for Zoom sessions. She would go to various college campuses, but she was never near our campus. And our homeless sort of outreach is pathetic. They give them Starbucks vouchers. So anyway, it just really reminded me of organizations such as the Women's Auxiliary that really don't exist to that degree anymore, because now we have these government agencies, but we need organizations like the Women's Auxiliary to help. And
it was my impression in looking over those records from the 1930s. I thought, well, the government really put the Women's Auxiliary out of business as far as charity was concerned. They took it away slowly in the next few decades. So and now, well, yeah, there's a lot of need for help.
All right, any final comments or?
Birte, this is Chris. I think it's amazing that you're able to find and match up all the many historical detailed pieces of information, the names, the dates, the addresses, the dollars, and then to kind of draw conclusions and weave it into a story that makes you understand what was going on. So thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. It was really, really fun. I enjoyed it, and I have to see how I can get out of those rabbit holes, that you keep following.
As you said, there's lots more to explore. There's a lot more information.
And I'm so glad that Francis is here. I'm so glad. So I have your envelope that you sent. It's on my desk, and as of next week, I'll be looking at that because I haven't had a chance yet. So thank you so much for sending that.
You're very welcome. Happy to do it.
All right, thanks everyone. I think we're going to end there. Thank you so much, Birte, and thanks everyone for tuning in today.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.